Not every student is going to learn best in a certain setting. Kids need options, family needs options.
It literally is a question of how do we help our public schools? You certainly don't help them by removing $500 million from their revenues.
Having that option for parents that their students are not being well served in a public setting is so important.
It's going to take a lot of dollars away from public education. The charter schools will take dollars away from public education. And our Constitution states that we will provide a free and thorough public education.
The charter schools are outperforming the public schools. So when there's competition in the market, it forces people to do better.
This is a Your Voice, Your Future Town Hall. Crisis in the Classroom.
Thank you for joining us. I'm Armstrong Williams, your moderator, and welcome to our Crisis in the Classroom School Choice Panel. Public education came under increased scrutiny during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now parents nationwide are raising concerns over transparency, test scores, and curriculums. Along with that, an increased demand for school choice, which would allow parents to use their education tax dollars to send their children to schools that best fit their needs. Sinclair National correspondent Kayla Gaskins gets us started tonight with a look at some of the issues that have parents across the country demanding action.
We will not sit idly by.
Fiery comments at a school board meeting in St. Louis, taking aim at the public education system for failing Black children.
I do not come in peace to people who hold no passion, no urgency, no care, and no love for Black folk.
Education activist Chester Asher delivering a poetically arranged speech, calling a system where only 3% of students are proficient in math and 10% proficient in reading deadly.
You applaud yourselves while allowing our schools to pile Black bodies on top of piles of Black bodies, because that is the result of an educational system that does not educate.
Asher going so far as equating the failing schools to slave owners. National data shows 80% of students in St. Louis public schools are Black. A Project Baltimore analysis conducted earlier this year found 0 students were proficient in math in 23 of Baltimore County public schools.
How is he supposed to be productive if he can't read?
The public school system, the school board, and the mayor are facing a lawsuit for their poor education system. Leading the suit,
this is what the fight is for. It's about his future.
Prominent civil rights attorney Ben Crump calling the failing system there a pipeline to prison.
Without education, a quality education, our children are already imprisoned. They just haven't slammed the jail cell door yet.
In California, parents advocating to make high-quality education a constitutional right. According to the Kids First campaign, just 10% of Black kids in California can read at grade level. Advocates working to get the measure on the ballot this fall. As poor performance issues persist in public schools, families increasingly looking for alternatives. Enrollment in charter and private schools both on the rise, so is support for school choice. In Washington, I'm Kayla Gaskins.
Now we have 4 panelists joining us, all well-versed in the hottest topics surrounding school choice. Corey DeAngelis is a school choice activist and senior fellow at the American Federation for Teachers and for Children. Angela Morabito is a former U.S. Department of Education spokeswoman who now works for the Defense of Freedom Institute. Joining us remotely, Dr. Joshua Cowan. He's a professor of education policy at Michigan State University, and we were expecting Marissa Perez-Diaz with the Texas State Board of Education to join us today, but you know how things happen. She had to cancel at the last minute. But fortunately, a colleague of hers, Stacy Childs, stepped in and agreed to be a part of this conversation tonight. She represents Houston's District 4 on the Texas State Board of Education. Thank you, Stacy. Let me start with you. Do you agree with the assertion that public schools are failing Black children disproportionately, and it's akin to slave ownership?
I think slave ownership is a stretch. I think public school teachers are doing the absolute best that they can. However, we have a lot of work to do. And nationally, I have to agree that public schools are largely failing Black students, despite the efforts taken, and we need to do a lot more.
But why?
Because I think as a nation, we haven't taken the time to realize what Black students need to thrive and what Black students need to learn. Every student is different. If you don't take the time to understand what that student needs to be successful, how can they be successful if you don't understand them?
Corey, what does your data tell you on this same question about Black kids all across America being disproportionately maligned and robbed through public education?
Well, we have public schools that discriminate on the basis of zip code, where if you live in a certain neighborhood, you live in a certain area, you're assigned to a failing school that's not working for you. If you want to do something else, you either have to have enough money to pay out of pocket, to pay twice, once for the public school through the property tax system, then once again out of pocket for private school tuition and fees. If you want to go to a better public school, well, some families have actually gone to jail for lying about their addresses to get into better so-called quote-unquote public schools. If you really want to gain access to a better school, in some cases, you might even have to move houses. Just imagine if you didn't like your nearest grocery store or restaurant. In order to get better food that wasn't poisoned, you had to move houses to get to a better restaurant. That wouldn't make any sense. It creates a huge geographic monopoly in the market for education that exists today. We don't do this with anything else. We don't assign people to grocery stores. We don't assign people to healthcare providers, but we assign kids to schools that are failing them for decades and telling them if they want a way out, they got to pay twice or move houses. That's totally ridiculous.
Angela, so does this tell us that in America, if you're socioeconomically disadvantaged and live in the wrong zip code, you pay a high price for the rest of your life?
It does. In places where school choice opportunities just don't exist, a child's future is determined by his or her zip code. That's absolutely disgraceful. America's public schools aren't getting the job done. When fewer than 40% of high school seniors are testing proficient in reading, we know, that is an educational state of emergency. I mean, Stacey, you said it yourself, every child is different. The current system does not recognize that. School choice does, and it gives parents options to send their child to the school where he or she is going to learn best.
Why do you, let me go to Josh. Why do you think this movement has gotten such traction in education? Is it something, has it to do more with parents? Does it have to do more with the education apparatus? What has changed?
It's a really good question. When you've been doing this as long as I have, you sort of the rhetoric around some of the stuff, it really hasn't changed. But what has changed for sure is that in red state legislatures, activists have been very able to push some of these things through. I mean, I'm sitting here in Michigan where the latest sort of Betsy DeVos school voucher bill failed twice in the last 24 months. So it's not everywhere. It's mostly in red state legislatures. But I think it's important to talk about kind of some of the structural and financial inequalities that are still plaguing our public school system. And then to unpack all the different kinds of school choice options that may or may not be effective. For example, open enrollment, letting students move between districts is on the table, has been shown to be a relatively effective solution. Some charter schools in some places, but when we're talking about these kind of Betsy DeVos voucher schemes, the last 10 years in particular have shown that they're not the solution. In fact, that kids, as bad as some children might be doing in some of the public schools in some of the areas, they do a lot worse when they transfer to private schools using these vouchers. So each of these sort of different solutions to this larger problem, I think, need to be unpacked and separated and not talked about as if they're one collective solution.
Corey, you don't necessarily agree with that assertion.
No, I mean, if the government schools are so much better than the private schools, well, then why are families actively choosing private schools when they get the opportunity? And why are the government schools so afraid of competition whenever you give families a choice to escape those same failing institutions? Maybe parents know their kids better than bureaucrats sitting in offices hundreds of miles away. And I disagree. I want to say I think the reason for all this is because the teachers unions really overplayed their hand over the past couple of years. You had Randy Weingarten and the AFT threatening safety strikes. They lobbied the CDC to make it more difficult to reopen schools over the pandemic period. And they basically held children's education hostage to secure multiple multi-billion-dollar ransom payments from the taxpayer. But they overplayed their hand because families got to see what was going on in the classroom. We're talking a lot about standardized test scores, but the argument for school choice has changed a little bit in that it's beyond that. Parents see schools as ways to raise their children, and parents who thought that their kids were even in good public schools, maybe they're A-rated schools by the state, started to see another dimension of school quality that I would say is arguably more important than anything that could be captured by a standardized test, which is whether the school's curriculum aligns with families' values. That's why we're seeing so much success. It's not all just Betsy DeVos. It's families don't like what's happening. We saw a video of a parent pushing back at a school board meeting earlier. What happens over the past few years? You had the NSBA, the National School Boards Association, when that kind of democratic accountability was trying to push back at school board meetings, they were labeling parents as domestic terrorists. That's not true accountability. The only true accountability is from the bottom up, allowing families to vote with their feet to education providers that best meet their needs.
Stacey, I'm coming to you, so hold tight, but I've got to give Dr. Cowan an opportunity to respond.
Well, I mean, listen, every single one of the clips that were played in the beginning of the intro was based on the outcomes of a standardized test. And so I think if we're having this conversation about, you know, using school choice, whether it's these DeVos style vouchers or anything else to kind of go to schools based on values and different sort of parent sorting, that's one conversation. If we're talking about using these DeVos style vouchers to leave public schools to get better academic outcomes as measured by math and reading standardized tests, then I'm here to tell you that the larger the program, the worse the results have been in the last 10 years. And so it's just not a solution to this academic issue. If we're talking about these other issues, you know, on values and so on and so forth, that's a completely different conversation than issues related to math, reading, and so on.
We're going to come back to this, but not now. Stacey, to you, along with that rise in support for school choice, we've seen a pretty significant jump in the number of people running for local school board positions. What do you think has driven that increase, and will it continue across this country?
I hope so. I hope it continues. I think people are sick and tired of taking people's word for it. I think for a long time, we just assumed that the teachers and the administrators were doing the right thing for kids. But as social media grew and as people started to become more privy to the facts and to the statistics, like we heard earlier, they are upset. And they're saying, if you're not going to do it, I'm going to do it myself. So I'm happy to see the number of people running, and I want to see more of it.
Angela, what about the accountability of these administrators that Stacey just have spoken of?
Well, right now, when there is no school choice, there's very little accountability because the existing school has a monopoly of everybody who lives inside that footprint. I think we're long overdue for accountability in public education. When you see so many schools where students aren't failing, the students are being failed by bureaucrats who do not have their best interests at heart. So the proof is in the pudding. You want to see parents hold their school systems accountable. Look at the success of existing school choice programs. They've been expanded in quite a number of states just in this past year, and not a single expansion has landed with a thud. They have all seen massive amounts of parental demand. So if you want to see accountability, look at the parents. Look at what they're choosing for their own children. They're choosing other options.
Stacey, back to you. How do you think remote learning played into all of this? Do you think parents are becoming more skeptical of public education?
Absolutely. I think parents are more skeptical, and I think they realize, wow, I don't even kind of understand what my student is learning. I need to take more of a role in what they're learning because they didn't know. So I think remote learning played a large part in this, and I think it showed the gaps that exist in education. Again, for a long while, parents just dropped their kids off at the school door, and maybe they picked them up 8 hours later, no questions asked. But what COVID-19 and the pandemic did was to show you what your student was learning all day and what you need to take part in.
So you're saying that once these parents began to realize what their children were learning directly in these Zoom classes, it was a game changer?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, look, parents woke up and they're never going back to sleep. We've seen increase in polling support for school choice. And I just got to mention that Josh said that the academic evidence is not positive. It actually is. If you look at the preponderance of the evidence, a majority of the random assignment studies find that if you get the funding to follow the child to a private institution of their choice, lo and behold, when parents get to choose and they know their kids better than anybody else, the academic performance tends to go up as well. And Josh has also admitted in a recent interview that the competitive effect studies are positive too. School choice is a rising tide that lifts all boats. There are 29 studies on this topic. 26 of 29 studies find statistically significant positive effects of private school choice competition on the outcomes in the public schools as well. So this is a win-win solution for people who use the program, and then competition leads to better outcomes for the students who remain in the public schools too. We don't want to destroy public schools. We don't want to defund them. This actually also leads to higher per student funding in the public schools because it's typically only the state funding that follows the child. They get to keep the local and federal funding. So on a per student basis, we're already spending over $18,000 per student per year in government schools in America. It'll actually end up even higher mathematically.
Now, Dr. Cowan, when we return from these messages, we're going to give you a chance to respond. So just hold your fire. We'll be back.
New York State ranks 46 in the nation for fourth grade math scores, while ranking #1 in the nation for per student spending. We are spending a colossal amount of money to get really, really bad results from our kids.
What a startling statistic. Wow. But welcome back, and thank you for watching this Crisis in the Classroom Town Hall, focused on school choice. Let's get right back to our panel. And before I start discussing these teachers' salaries, let me give Dr. Cowan, as I promised, a chance to respond.
Well, listen, it depends on what the goal is, right? So the reality of the situation is that study after study after study over the last decade has shown repeatedly that the more money that goes to any educational outcome system or school, you get better results, right? There are some studies that show if you threaten vulnerable communities with funding loss, either through charter schools or these Betsy DeVos style vouchers, that you will see some small upticks in test scores. But you know, they're dwarfed by the academic loss that comes from students switching from public schools to these sort of subprime voucher schools that rush into there. So it's a funding stream issue. I don't know that we make public policy in any other way like that, where we're going to give a little bit of support for one community by threatening funding loss, and then for the kids who the policy is actually directed for, they lose, twice as much as any of the sort of COVID-related or learning loss that we've seen more recently. So it's not a very compelling way to make policy, but it is true that if you threaten vulnerable communities with funding loss, there will be some small upticks in test scores. It just depends on sort of how you want to frame the package of policy alternatives.
President Biden recently said that American public schools teachers need to get a raise. Critics jumped on him, pointing out that teachers' salaries have been steadily increasing for the past several decades, and that student performance has plummeted. Now, let me come to you, Angela. Dr. Cowan unequivocally said, the more money, the better results. Take a look at New York, 30,000 per student, ranked number 46 in math. Let's take Washington, D.C. They spend all this money, little to show for it. Let's take Baltimore, Maryland. They spend all this money, and look at the 23 schools that are that are not performing, not proficient in math, English, and reading? Not one school. Does your stats and your research reaffirm what Dr. Cowan has just asserted?
The data actually contradicts that in its entirety. If America's educational woes could be solved by more funding, we would actually have one of the best public education systems on earth, because we spend more per student than nearly any other country. But instead of having a first-rate education system, we really rank towards the middle of the pack when you look at international comparisons of test scores of our 15-year-olds compared to those in other countries. More funding is not the answer. It's not about the dollar amount, it's about how you use it. If more funding was really just like the cure-all, you would see places like Chicago, Baltimore, New York City having the best educational outcomes. Instead, theirs are among the worst. So it's not a matter of funding, it's a matter of policy.
You know, before I go to Corey, I want to get Ms. Childs, and I see you waving. I got you. Talk to us.
I have to disagree. While funding is not the end all be all, it's the start. The teachers that I talk to every day, the teachers that I used to teach with, need to feel valued when they go to work. And if you're not paying them something that gives them dignity, then why would I even want to come to work? Think about the pandemic. You have me coming in person every day, basically being a superhero to these students. And then when the pandemic comes, you want me to learn how to do everything remotely, learn these new systems without any professional development, and still pay me the same amount? Yes, funding is not the end all be all, but it's a start, and we need to make teachers feel dignified if you want them to produce what we're asking them to produce for kids.
But Corey, you believe that...
Look,
tell us what you believe.
Yeah, look, throwing more money at the problem is not going to solve it. It's the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. I said earlier, we spend over $18,000 per student per year in the United States government school system. That number has increased 155% since 1970 after adjusting for inflation. But the money's there. It's just not making its way into the classroom because monopolies have no incentive to spend those additional dollars wisely. You need competition to get more money into the classroom instead of going towards administrative bloat and Randy Weingarten, who makes over $500,000 a year to trap kids or to fight to trap kids in failing government schools. Teacher salaries over the same period have only increased by about 8% in real terms. And 5 studies that I've seen on the topic find statistically significant positive effects of school choice competition on the teacher salaries in the public schools too. And look, Josh admitted earlier that the public school results actually improve in response to competition, and that's the main argument you hear from the other side against school choice, that this will dismantle or defund or destroy the public schools. Well, now we have both sides of the debate, it seems, agreeing on the point that competition leads to better outcomes. In state capitals and in news interviews, people aren't making the argument that giving families a choice is hurting their own kids. That seems to be like an elitist argument, implying that low-income families somehow don't know what's best for their own children. The thing is, they do.
Let's give Stacy a chance to respond. Stacy?
Sure. I'm sure you have a lot of footnotes and some sources that you can give me, but what I've heard and what I've seen is that when you pay teachers more, they actually enjoy going to work and they feel dignified to teach students. I mean, think about it. If I'm getting whooped by the amount of rigor that my job accounts for, and my classroom is overcrowded. I'm supposed to be teaching a class of, let's say, 18, and there are 35 or 36 students in the same classroom with all different learning abilities, with different issues. I have to handle all of that, and then I can't even pay my bills when the paycheck comes. Then why would I feel excited about meeting your standards? Why would I even want to? So I think while it's not the end all be all, as I said before, it is an absolute necessary start to pay teachers what they're worth. It's no reason that every teacher in America is not making over $100,000 a year. This is a profession, just like being a doctor, just like being a lawyer.
Angela, how do you respond? I mean, listen, there are many teachers out who share her sentiments. Where's the balance?
The balance is treating teachers like the professionals that they are, and that means rewarding the really great ones. Right now, where teacher unions have a lot of control, teachers get paid not on what they do in the classroom, but just how long they've been in the classroom. It does not reward good performance. It does not hold people accountable for poor performance, and it is students who ultimately pay the price. So just as competition benefits all schools, I believe that teachers should be held to really high standards and should be looked at as unique individuals, the same way we ought to be looking at students. Let's reward those great teachers. Let's make sure they make at least something decent compared to the nearly $500,000 a year that the teacher union boss Randy Weingarten makes. That is just a disgrace. Great teachers deserve better than what they get under a government monopoly.
Let me go back to Dr. Cowing. It's interesting, Dr. Cowing, that the most recent National Assessment of Educational Progress, NAEP, score shows 8th grade test scores on U.S. history and civics have taken a nosedive since the pandemic. But what's really interesting, Dr. Cowing, is that U.S. history scores have been dropping for the past 10 years. Where are public schools going wrong, do you think, on these critical subjects?
Well, public schools are under attack. I mean, many of the questions, even framed in this panel, sort of are pretty aggressive against the public schools in the first place. But listen, public school advocates aren't the ones trying to ban books from classrooms. Public school advocates aren't the ones trying to change how history is taught and tell you how to teach history. Public schools aren't the ones who are going out there denying election results in 2020. Public schools aren't the ones who are sort of trying to make it harder to vote. All of these things about history and civics, the NAEP exam is an important indicator, and I think we need to take it seriously. But again, it goes back to whether you believe these standardized test measures or not. And I think, we need to be careful about kind of bouncing back and forth and using standardized test scores when we're talking about threatening vulnerable communities with funding loss and saying, well, test scores are great there, but don't pay any attention to test scores when we look at how kids do when they go into these Betsy DeVos style voucher programs. And same with NAEP. Like if we're going to sort of wring our hands about NAEP scores in history for the last 10 years and try to solve that by limiting what states can do and teach in the classroom. In Arkansas, for example, the same bill that passed these DeVos style vouchers just threatened schools from who wanted to teach AP African American history. I just declined to accept the idea that less information is a way to solve the problems that do exist, especially with COVID.
Corey?
Well, this isn't a conversation about whether we should have CRT bans or bans on gender ideology in the classroom. This is a conversation about school choice, and this is the better solution. I think Josh and I can actually agree here that we shouldn't have top-down controls inside a one-size-fits-all system where you have one group of parents or even a minority of special interest, the teachers unions, determining how to raise other people's children. The better solution is from the bottom up. Let everybody choose the education providers that work best for their own kids and align with their own values. That way you can sort into the schools that you agree with, and so that we don't have to control the minds of other people's children. If you want to send your kid to a school that has CRT, I'm okay with that, but you shouldn't force me to send my child to a school that doesn't have it. And look, we talked about spending earlier as well. I'm kind of ambivalent about what the optimal level of spending ought to be, but this is a conversation about where that money ought to go. It should go to people, not buildings. We should fund students, not systems. The funding should go directly to the student, and parents should be able to choose where to take that money to the education provider that best meets their needs and aligns with their values. And that could be a public school. That option's still on the table. If you like your public school, you can keep your public school. For real this time, unlike with your doctor.
Dr. Cowing, does any of that sound reasonable to you?
Which part?
Any of it.
Listen, the question is, what problem are we trying to solve, right? If the problem we're trying to solve is the title of this panel is Crisis in the Classroom. If the problem we're trying to solve is improving academic outcomes in public schools, in particular as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, what I'm telling you is that these Betsy DeVos style voucher schemes don't work, and they haven't worked for more than a decade. If we're trying to solve this larger kind of social or culture war issue about values and CRT and all this business that, honestly, that's a completely different conversation. And I'm not really sure how to respond to that, because at this point, if we're going to be, there's 16,000 different schools in this country on the public schools. They all have very different curriculum. They all have very different ways of learning. It's very difficult to lump all of these things in together. So I think we're kind of pushing all these things in different directions.
Hold that point. We're gonna take a break and come back, Dr. Cohen. I'm Armstrong Williams. Crisis in the classroom.
You guys are slandering my name and pretending that these people have no brains to think for themselves because they don't want porn in the school.
This crisis in the classroom town hall is all about school choice and the issues surrounding it. One hot button topic has been the role of content in schools. What should or should not be allowed, and how much parents should be informed along the way. Let's bring our panel back. Stacy, data from the National Center for Educational Statistics shows that public school enrollment fell by more than 1 million after the onset of the pandemic. How do you think the pandemic played a role in parents deciding to pull their children from public schools?
I feel like largely parents don't think that public schools were doing what they should have been doing by their students. And when they realized that there were other options, such as public charters, they decided to try something different. But I think the bigger issue here is not just if you're going to go to a public school or a public charter or a private school, it's whether or not you're going to be taught well and taught accurately, and whether or not your school is giving you the correct information to make you a productive citizen in society, which is very interesting right now.
We talk about parents pulling themselves kids out of schools, Angela, but one of the things that we alluded to in coming back is the content, the sexual content, the sexual movement with children. And how much of a role should parents play?
Parents should be in the driver's seat, full stop. They deserve absolute transparency into what their children are learning. And that's why the pandemic was such a pivotal moment in the school choice movement. It lit a fire under a movement that was already in progress, because remote learning was always remote, was not always learning. And when parents realized what their kids were not being taught, reading, writing, arithmetic, and what they were being taught, which is in many cases a lot of CRT, a lot of gender ideology, you see these schools that are driving an agenda, and parents are standing up and saying no. The government has no right to force parents to send their children to a school that teaches them things that run contrary to their values, and in many cases contrary to basic facts. Forcing parents to do this is absolutely wrong, and that's why you see across all demographic lines, across all socioeconomic lines, regardless of race, parents favor school choice. The only demographic that doesn't is actually white liberals. So I believe we should trust the people who are closest to their children, who are most likely to be stuck in schools that are failing their kids. Let's give parents the right to choose rather than pretending that government knows better than they do.
A lot of people toss out labels like popcorn. You said white liberals. What are you saying?
According to polling data, those are white people who lead Democratic. That's exactly what was in the polling data, and that's the one group that is standing in the way of school choice.
And you think they believe they know what's best for those little poor little black kids in terms of the classroom and the learning environment?
I believe they do think that, because there is absolutely no other reason under the sun to deny parents the options to send their kids to a school of their choosing that meets the family's needs and matches their values.
Wouldn't it seem logical, like everybody on this panel, we've had enough time to see what doesn't work in the classroom? Wouldn't their agenda be to make sure that these kids are educated, don't lead a life of crime and drugs and petty theft, and that they have the possibility of living out the American dream?
Of course. I had the honor of serving under Betsy DeVos under the prior administration, and she was absolutely clear that school choice is a civil rights issue. Consigning a child to a failing school just because of where their family lives is a disgrace. You're cutting people off from reaching their full academic potential. It's just unconscionable that parents are stuck. They are desperate for ways out, and yet they're not being given those methods because of really the teacher unions and their allies in the education bureaucracy.
Corey, is this decline in public school enrollment exclusive to the post-pandemic? What do you think has contributed to families exploring these other options?
Parents have woken up. They saw what was going on in the classroom. They don't want to send their kids to institutions for 13 years where they feel like they're being indoctrinated in ways that don't align with their values. They don't want schools teaching their kids to hate them. I mean, that's pretty basic. Vodi Bakum said it best. To dislike them and their way of life. We can disagree about the word that we use, but Vodi Bakum said it best. We cannot continue to send our children to Caesar for their education and be surprised when they come home as Romans. So people have been voting with their feet. Over 1 million leaving the government school system, but who's leaving or who is left already? It's the most advantaged that have the resources to be able to pay for private school tuition and fees. A lot of these liberals are hypocrites because they say, oh, I'm so supportive of public schools, but then they send their own kids to private schools or they attended private schools themselves. You think about Joe Biden. He went to private school, he sent his kids to private school, but he opposes that choice for less advantaged families. That is beyond the depth of hypocrisy, and it's totally ridiculous, but all families should have that opportunity. Let's give that $18,000 or so per student that we spend in the government schools, redirect it to families and let them choose. You'll expand educational opportunity. This will lead to more equality of opportunity by giving less advantaged families more access to school choice as well.
Stacey, we've seen parents across this country, especially your home state of Texas, take issue with content in their children's schools having to do with sexual orientation and gender identity. Should parents, from your experience and where you sit in the educational hierarchy, be made aware if their child's teacher intend to discuss these topics?
Sure, I think parents should know what their students are learning or what their children are learning. However, I don't think that gives rise to allowing us to manipulate what has happened in our country, manipulate the truth, and cherry pick what we're going to teach students. That's two different things. So yes, I think parents should be involved, especially as you get into middle school and high school. Your teachers give you a syllabi, they let you know what's going to be taught. I think parents should be involved in that process. However, I do not think that should allow us to, again, cherry pick what we're going to be teaching students, because that doesn't make them informed citizens as they grow up. And let's be clear, teaching CRT or teaching the civil rights movement or things about Frederick Douglass is not why people are leaving public schools. People are leaving public schools and trying out different options because there have been gaps that have existed in schools in this country for years, and they're ready for something different.
Dr. Cowan, what would you add or take away from what you're hearing?
Listen, I don't know who has kids on this panel, who's actually a parent, but I mean, I have 5 children in public schools right now, and the idea that parents aren't involved, I mean, as soon as we're done with this conversation, I'm taking my sport coat off. I'm going to already meet first week of class with my kids' teachers and help out with football practice after school. Like, parent-teacher conferences are all over the place. You can walk in. The idea that parents aren't involved in public schools and have no say, I mean, I just don't know where it's coming from. I think it's kind of a made-up crisis, to be honest with you. Polling does show that parents in general are skeptical of any sort of institution right now. But the same polling tells us that parents are really satisfied on average with their own public school, even if they might conceptually be displeased with the broader public school. So I think we get really dangerous when we talk about what parents of any sort want, other than outside of our own home. And I guess I would just encourage everybody on this panel to sort of think about, your own experiences are going to be very different than what other folks say and do. And there are plenty of options. I get emails every week from the 4 schools my kids are in, asking about, come in, view the curriculum, volunteer in class, read books in class. And that happens in schools all across the country. So I'm not,
I got to tell you this, Dr. Cowan. I felt the temperature rise in the studio when you made it out to be a made-up crisis. So let me give Corey a chance to respond to that fact.
Yeah.
Do you have kids, Corey?
Yeah, look, Josh, you're talking about experiences, right? You went to private school yourself. I'm glad that you had that opportunity, but other families should have that opportunity as well. And you shouldn't turn around after getting that opportunity, close the door behind you, and tell less advantaged families that, if they get a choice, that it's actually going to hurt their kids if they choose for their own families. They know better than you about what's best for their own children. They know better than bureaucrats sitting in offices hundreds of miles away. And to add to that, you were trying to say that families are super happy with their public schools. You look at the latest Gallup polling that finds a all-time low in support for the public education system. About 26% of the American public has confidence in the public school system. And if it's true, though, that people actually do like their public school, as I said earlier, if you like your public school, you can keep your public school. You shouldn't be so afraid of competition and allowing families to choose. Why would giving families a choice defund public schools if they're happy with those institutions? They keep getting the same money that they were getting before because they're funded based on enrollment counts. If everybody's going to stay there, fine. I'm ambivalent. I don't care if you choose a public or a private school, but it shouldn't be up to you. It should be up to the parents of their own children.
Angela, concerns over graphic, I want to come back to this sexualized content, has been one of the big drivers of the school choice movement. And do you think it's difficult for parents to trust public schools after learning books and curriculums with graphic content may have been presented to their children?
Of course. It's obscene that parents even have to go to a school board meeting and beg the powers that be, please do not put pornographic material in the hands of my kindergartner. We've seen time and again these parents who show up at school board meetings, read from a book that is presented to their children, and they get shut down or even in some cases dragged out because the book is so explicit. Adults don't want to hear it, and yet they want to put it in front of children.
No, speaking of books and studies, you recently authored a study about how teachers' unions have allegedly been pushing educations to talk more about gender identity and sexual orientation in the classroom. Based on what you say now, why do you think teachers' unions are fixated on these issues?
It's because teacher unions think they own America's kids, and that's absolutely false. You see why parents are trying to leave the public school system in droves, why they are leaving in droves. Nobody should be forced to send their child to a place that is going to put explicit content or offensive content or content that teaches them to hate their parents in the hands of children. It's absolutely ridiculous. These teacher unions think that they can displace the role of parents in a child's life. So it is absolutely no surprise that parents don't like that very much. They want out.
Let me come back to Dr. Cowan, who seems to have a very different perspective here. Do you think parents have any justification in being angry with their local school board if, say, they find out about a book with sexual imagery is available in their child's school library?
See, that's the part that I think, I guess I would just disagree with my fellow panelists here. I don't think that this is the thing that is bothering most parents. Like, if you actually have children and you are worried about them, you're staying up in the middle of the night with them when they throw up, you're taking them to the ER when they have high fevers, you're worried about how they are going to make it to school when they're driving, And when you talk about school boards, I mean, listen, my concern with my school board right now is are the bills getting paid? Are the buildings getting refurbished? There's a lot of different issues. And I think, again, we have to be really careful when we're sitting there claiming to speak for all parents, especially if we don't have children of our own, that we're just going to kind of come in there and wear a parent shirt and say, we know what's best for all parents. Everybody's talking about teacher unions here. I don't even know that that's something that the average American thinks about. I don't think that they think any more about teacher unions than some people think about Betsy DeVos and her billions of dollars in West Michigan. Like, the reality
well, you know
is
what, some of our panelists think they should think more about teachers unions, Dr. Cowan, and the impact that it has on education throughout this country. But it's time for a quick break. But coming up, we'll talk about the impact geography and socioeconomics may have on a school choice for families. Stay with us.
She said, I can't read, just like that. I thought, are you serious? You can't read? And she said, no. I said, well, I'm gonna see what I can do to help you.
And welcome back to our closing segment. We're going to cover some important issues when it comes to school choice, including geography, socioeconomics, and overall access to education. Let's bring back our panel. But before we get back to these hot button issues, Stacey, you just heard this parent talk about the fact that the child could not read. How is it possible that a child can go through school and end up graduating not being able to read, especially in today's America that we live in?
It's true. I used to teach 5th grade, and by 5th grade, you should be able to read. And a lot of my students did not know how to read at all once they got to my classroom. I think it's a lot of pressure put on public school teachers, a lot of pressure to be the best, to have certain test scores, and to move the kids along. And a lot of teachers, under the pressure, will do whatever they have to get a high rating and move on. So I absolutely have met some of my former students, and even now as an attorney, my clients that are 17, 18, 19 years old that can't read in America.
How do you respond?
That is proof positive that our current education system is not working. And I would strongly disagree with the idea that getting students to read by the time they graduate high school is too much pressure to put on teachers. That's the most basic function of their job. They need to be given the resources that they need to make that happen. And we see the education bureaucracy is in some cases making that impossible. So I do feel for those teachers, but it's just absolute proof that our education system has lost its way. It's prioritizing everything except the educational basics that students need to be successful after graduation, if they even get to graduation.
You know, Corey, one of the states where school choice has stalled this year is where Stacey is located, Texas. Lawmakers there who oversee rural areas are concerned that there are very few options for those students outside of public schools. What school choice measures can benefit those families?
Yeah, look, I'm from San Antonio, Texas, too, and Greg Abbott's going to call them back for a special session. The Senate has the votes to pass it. The governor's supportive, and the House, maybe they'll get the ball across the finish line as well during the special session. But look, this is the dumbest argument I've ever heard against school choice, that, well, on the one hand, we live in a rural area, so there's not a lot of exit options. But then on the other hand, the next breath, the same people making this argument will say, well, this is going to destroy and defund our public schools in rural areas. Well, one, if they're great public schools in the rural areas, you should have nothing to worry about. But two, if you have the fewest exit options, you really shouldn't have anything to worry about. And look, the 9 most rural states in the country, I've tweeted this out or posted on X before, they all have some form of private school choice already. They were able to get it done in places like West Virginia, where they have universal school choice, one of the most rural states in the country, and Maine and Vermont. They have some of the oldest school choice programs in the country, dating back to the late 1800s, where they created vouchers for families in rural areas because they didn't have a public school, because they didn't have options. The state figured out in the 1800s, both these states, to give money to parents so they could have more opportunities. Being rural is not an argument against expanding choices. It's an argument for expanding choices. They figured this out a long time ago.
Let me bring Stacey back. Stacey, how could school choice measures create obstacles for those families? Have we seen that school choices impact rural areas in the same way it impacts urban and suburban areas?
Sure. I'm not really convinced that just automatically putting more private school options in these areas is just going to fix things and do the deal. How are we actually going to hold these private school leaders accountable when something goes wrong in those private schools? I think private schools is not just a magic wand and something's going to miraculously happen just because we have more options. I think teachers need to get paid more. I think we need to realize the gaps that lie in education, and we need to handle those gaps. I don't think putting private schools just in rural areas, urban areas, or anywhere is going to solve it, because we can't even hold those people accountable, and we're giving them tax dollars.
Angela?
If you're looking at this as a debate just between public and private schools, I think you're taking way too narrow a view of school choice. Some of the best options, particularly for people in rural areas, are things like micro schools or things like home schools. And still, the same principle holds true. The money should follow the student. That's the whole point of school choice, is that what students need look different depending on who they are, where they live, and the needs of their families. So this is not entirely about public schools versus private schools. This is about the current educational status quo versus options for parents to even, in many cases, build the schooling option that makes the most sense for their own families.
Stacey, is there anything that Angela just said that you could embrace and make sense to you?
Sure. I think public charters is something that's becoming more popular, that I've seen work in certain areas, but I'm still not convinced that giving a parent or a family a check for a certain amount of money and saying, hey, you can go to a private school, you can go to any school you want, is just going to change things. I'm just not convinced. We've been on this panel maybe 45, 50 minutes, and I haven't heard anyone say, this is where this has worked, it's going to work everywhere else.
Well, stop. Let me give them a chance to answer that. Tell us, Corey, where it has worked.
Well, what about for higher education? Democrats tend to support funding students directly when it comes to Pell Grants or the GI Bill to go to a private school, even a religious university. You could take it to a public or community college if you want to. Democrats support Head Start or other pre-K programs where the funding goes directly to the family, and then they can choose different providers.
But the question is,
pre-K.
where has it worked? That's the question.
It's worked in Florida. Look at the competitive effect studies in Florida. They have 10 out of the 11 studies find statistically significant positive effects on private school choice competition on the outcomes in the public schools. And Florida has rural areas too. They just put out a report out of Florida finding that since school choice has expanded over the past couple of decades in Florida, the number of private schools in rural areas has effectively doubled. So supply meets demand. If you put the money into the hands of the families, the providers will come into the market and respond to the needs of those families. And we've seen that happen in Florida. If it didn't, let's say that didn't happen in Texas, for example, and the public schools in the rural areas are so great, well, the worst case scenario is that you're left with those great public schools in the rural areas in Texas. You don't have to go to another option. If you like your public school, you can keep it.
Is there an argument that it does not work?
Absolutely. Listen, the last 10 years of research on these sort of Betsy DeVos school voucher schemes that we've been talking so much about today.
Here's the good news. Here's the good news. We're out of time. This has been a fantastic discussion that will be continued all across the country. You guys have ignited something here. I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us for this hour and sharing their expertise. You can read more about school choice in a book I wrote with former United States Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Dr. Ben Carson, and attorney Ben Crump, called Crisis in the Classroom. It's available to purchase in bookstores and online. And as we've seen in this discussion, there are multiple sides to this hot button issue. The conversation is not expected to slow down, and nor should it, as several 2024 presidential candidates are making it a focus of their campaigns, and that's a good thing. So as we continue to dive into our education system, we hope to continue to shine a light on what matters most to families nationwide By working together, we can make sure all families have a voice. I'm Armstrong Williams. Thank you for watching.